What in the world can help the church? Where in the world should we start to search? Why in the world are we prone to lurch back and forth from urge to perch? What in the world can give us hope to widen our vision and broaden our scope when we're at the end of our rope and tempted to wallow and wither and mope? What in the world? Where in the world? Who in the world? Who in the world? What in the world can help the church?
Hello, Holy Posters, and welcome to the first episode of our special series based on the book Inalienable, How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church. Inalienable was co-authored by Eric Costanzo, a pastor and teacher from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and Matthew Soerens, the U.S. Director for Church Mobilization at World Relief. On the Holy Post podcast, we value introducing you to voices and ideas that may be unfamiliar to the Christian context you've come from. Well, in this special series, we crank that value up to 11. In each episode of What in the World, I'll be speaking to a Christian leader from outside the American church, not only to hear about how they understand and practice their faith differently than we do, but also to help us see our own blind spots, our cultural idols, and the assumptions we carry into our faith. That often happens best when we engage with our sisters and brothers from outside our own culture. After each interview, I'll then be joined by one or more of the authors of Inalienable to debrief and apply what we've heard. We've structured these 4 episodes around the 4 sections of the book. Today we're looking at the kingdom of God and asking, how big is the scope of the gospel, and what happens when we discover the American church isn't at the center of it? My guest today is Dr. Ruth Padilla DeBorst. She's the Associate Professor of World Christianity at Western Theological Seminary. She's lived for many years in Costa Rica as a member of Casa Adobe, an international Christian community with deep concerns for right living in relation to the whole of creation. She is a practitioner, teacher, and speaker with decades of experience in ministry throughout Latin America, and she has served the global church through World Vision International, Resonate Global Missions of the Christian Reformed Church of North America, the International Fellowship for Missions as Transformation, the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization, and many more. She earned her doctorate from the Boston University School of Theology with concentrations in missiology and social ethics, and has a master's degree from Wheaton College. After our conversation, I'll be joined by Daniel Yang and Matt Soerens, 2 of Inalienable's authors, for the debrief. Here is Dr. Ruth Padilla DeBorst. Ruth Padilla DeBorst, thank you for being here on the Holy Post. So grateful to have you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
And you are coming in from Costa Rica today, so hopefully there's not too much of a lag on our connection, but you are quoted a number of times in this book, Inalienable, and today we're going to focus on the topic of the kingdom of God. And one of the major themes that comes out in the book is the dramatic shift over the last century or so from Christianity being primarily a Northern Hemisphere faith centered in North America and Europe, and its shift to the global South, Africa, Asia, Latin America. One of the things you've spoken about in numerous places and in this book is the relationship between the church in the Northern Hemisphere and its relationship to the church in the global South, and some of the misunderstandings that exist between those 2 spheres of the church. Can you describe your perception of how particularly the American church misunderstands or miscalculates the contribution of the Latin American church and the Southern church to global Christianity?
So I guess misunderstanding. I think what is the root of some of that misunderstanding? It's important to name it. And that is some of these assumptions that where there is power, where there is privilege, where there has been accumulated through time a certain status, then obviously from that place must emanate the right kind of doctrine and the right form of living out faith and such. So there's this assumption that power and right go together, might and right. And so I think even more than a misunderstanding, there's a blindness to the value, to the contributions, to the richness of what God has been doing in and through churches outside of that paradigm of power and of Christendom. And so that's power blinds and obscures the sensitivity to the contributions from outside of that mold of power.
Let's talk about what that looks like on a very small scale. There are a lot
Mm-hmm.
of churches in the United States, mission agencies, nonprofit organizations that send people sometimes on short-term trips to the global south, to Latin America. You've been critical of that model and some of its foibles, abuses. I don't know what
Yes.
word we want to put
Mm-hmm.
on it.
Mm-hmm.
Explain why
Mm-hmm.
you find this problematic.
Yeah, again, the problem is it's these assumptions that because we have more, then we know more, then we have nothing to learn. And so the whole idea of a mission as something from the haves to the have-not, where a true recognition of the body of Christ and the work of the Spirit in that body, in those Christian communities, a real assessment, a humble assessment, would help us recalibrate, would help North American teams recognize that as they come to the global south in some way, they have as much or more to learn from local communities that have been working on what it means to be faithful to to the good news of the gospel in the midst of situations that don't have all the power and privilege. And so that learning is really essential, but you're never going to learn if you don't recognize your need to learn. So if you come with this prejudice of power and privilege and know it all and have it all and give to those poor people down there, then you're just closing the door to the opportunity to learn and to see God's work outside of your mode of operation.
The Bible story that comes to mind as you're speaking is John 9, where Jesus heals the blind man, and the Pharisees are very upset about this. And at the end of the chapter, Jesus says about the Pharisees, because they say they can see, they remain blind. But if you would admit you're
Exactly.
blind, then you would see. And it sounds like that's what's happening in a lot of the
Precisely.
American church.
Precisely.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the
Mm-hmm.
things you believe the American church is blind to that our sisters and brothers in the global south could open our eyes to if we would just be humble enough to admit our blindness?
Mm. So I think one of the issues is, again, I just keep going back to assumptions. This assumption that that the U.S. is in some ways some new chosen people, light on the hill, and all these myths of American and then cultural Christianity, where there's the lack of discernment about what is cultural value and what is gospel value. And some of that happens precisely because there's been this wedding between power and faith, which we could summarize as Christendom, where so much of the global south has not had that. In Latin America, being a Christian, Protestant, evangelical Christian have been minorities. They've been excluded from the opportunity to have power because it was the Roman Catholic conquistadores, with the assimilation was between the Roman Catholic Church and power. And so those who were not Roman Catholic were minorities and had to grapple with what it meant to be faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ, not to the gospel of their nation, state, or their cultural values. And so there was a possibility in many cases of being an alternative community, of following Jesus out of a radical, almost sacrificial calling, in contrast to these assumptions that get so conflated, so assimilated
So
in the
one of the
North.
dynamics we're seeing here in the United States, to your point, evangelicals especially are beginning to feel more and more like a minority in the American context. But in response to that new status, a lot of people are striving to regain power, to regain authority over the culture, over the government, over the economy, many aspects of the society. Protestants and evangelicals in Latin America have never had power, as you said. They've always been marginalized and a minority. Why haven't evangelicals in Latin America done what evangelicals are doing here, which is try to gain power and domination in their communities, in their cultures? Why is that not an impulse in Latin American Christianity?
I actually would change the question, because the reality is there are evidences of that impulse. I think it's human frailty and sin that there are those among Protestant evangelicals in Latin America who now say, oh, now we're growing in number, now we're bigger proportionate to the rest of the population, so now it's our turn. You had your turn, you Catholics, now it's our turn. And so now we're going to have political parties, and we're going to institute our privileged time. And so there is that strand, and it is, to me, problematic, and it has come with growth. It has come when we feel we have power, because now we have the numbers. And so at the same time, there is a strand that would question that and say, no, we are called to live as an alternative community in the midst of the reality of our context, and to be salt and light in that context, and not get co-opted by or too enamored with power.
So you attribute that to just our human sinful nature, and as numbers grow, people want to exert power. Can you attribute any of it to American Christian values infiltrating pockets of Latin America?
Absolutely.
Is it coming?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
yes.
where does
so you have
explain that?
Right. It's true. So particularly kind of the neo-Pentecostal movement with its prosperity gospel and the name it and claim it kind of power trip, that is impacting Latin America enormously. You have, it's just, they're just as you have these feudal patriarchal systems of within the U.S. and a supposed theology to justify those hierarchical modes of being. You get that coming into Latin America, and so you have these mega churches with the mega leader in the mega Italian suit and the mega car, and justifying all of that as this is evidence of God's blessing, and just as God has blessed us in this, now he can bless us as we step into political power in our nations.
Yeah, so the prosperity gospel has been a major export of the United States around the world. And yet, it's not the entirety of the American church, right? There are good elements of the American church as well, of course. So one of the things I have heard from American church leaders as a way of dismissing the contribution of Latin American Christianity is the stereotype that Latin American Christianity is just liberation theology. And that is dismissed, and it's not the gospel, and we can be done with it, so we don't have to listen to anybody in Latin America. Just as you could say, we don't have to listen to anybody in America because they're all just prosperity gospel preachers. It's a stereotype. It's an over-exaggeration. So how do you respond to that dismissiveness of liberation theology as some kind of heresy? As a Latin American believer and theologian, give me your response to that.
Right. So on the one hand, I think there is a need to recognize that when Jesus states his mission, liberation from oppression, from blindness, from all these heavy life-sapping things is part of the good news of Jesus Christ, of God's good reign, Jesus says, I came to give life and life in abundance. So there is an element of liberation inherent to the gospel. Now, the issue is the prejudice that saying that then makes you a liberationist theologian or a liberationist church. And the reality is that the theologies, and that's plural, the theologies of liberation were a very strong movement, particularly within the Roman Catholic Church. Some Protestants also. A very diverse movement. There were liberationists that would have taken up arms with guerrilla fighters and espoused a very Marxist paradigm and justified violence in order to bring liberation. But there were liberationists who would never have taken up arms, and there were liberationists who relativized the value of a Marxist analysis. And within Latin America, there's a strand of theology that responded to the very same contextual challenges of the 60s, 70s in Latin America: dictatorships, oppressive regimes, disappearances, extreme poverty, and all of this. There is a strand from a more evangelical matrix that sought to respond biblically, theologically, and in lived engagement, incarnationally, to these realities without espousing violence, without espousing Marxist critical analysis, but looked at this and called this integral mission. The mission of the church has to do with every single last dimension of life, and it cannot just close itself into and reduce the gospel to spiritual matters, to the relationship between the individual and God for salvation, for the future. It has to be, if it is good news, it must be good news today, in the midst of the challenges and the difficulties and the beauty of our Latin America. And so this is a rich strand that is very little known because it's just all been blanketed as a liberationist.
Yeah, it's one of the things that intrigues me the most as an American, as I've traveled around the world, as I've engaged with Christian sisters and brothers. The American church has this bizarre history where we have bifurcated, we have separated spiritual that individual gospel of personal salvation from social context, from social engagement, from healing of even bodies and unjust
Absolutely.
structure.
Mm-hmm.
We've called one the social gospel and one the true gospel. But when you get outside the American context, people look at you like you're crazy, because those things aren't separated in Jesus' ministry. He both proclaimed the gospel and
Exactly.
called people to himself, and he touched and healed and freed people from oppression. One of the big issues facing the American church is that it is browning very quickly. We are seeing a lot of immigrants come into the United States, predominantly from Christian backgrounds, who are transforming elements of the American church. What about that gives you hope for the American church, and what worries you about that dynamic?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, so there is the saying that rather than de-Christianizing the U.S., immigrants are Christianizing America or the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, so many of the immigrants are believers, and their faith is part of their migration story, even of seeing God's opening up opportunity for them to not be murdered in their home country because of the extreme violence that is taking place and such. So I guess what gives me hope is there is an opportunity there. There is an opportunity for more homogeneous local congregations to open up to the gifts and the perspectives and the lived faith of people from outside their typical circles. I guess the risk is that the problem, I guess, is that power and privilege can kind of whitewash integration and say, yes, you are welcome as long as you become like us. So if you erase some of your particularities, some of those distinctives, some of those things that make us uncomfortable, if you quit asking questions that might challenge the status quo, then you're welcome. And of course, then everybody ends up all the poorer because it denies the identity of these people and it denies the opportunity to learn from them. At the same time, it's not a one-sided thing because the migrant himself or herself might feel like the only way to really make it in the U.S. society is to neutralize, to lower, to hide their identity, and so there would just more than a risk. There's just a huge loss in that scenario.
You've talked a lot about the power dynamics, even in this scenario of immigrants coming in and the possibility of assimilation and surrendering of one's identity in order to assimilate. How does money play into this and economics? I mean, the United States is enormously wealthy and the American church is enormously wealthy. Many countries and communities in the global South, including in Latin America, are resource dependent on other places in the U.S. Is there a way for American Christians to wield their wealth in a way which is not dehumanizing or disrespectful, or in a way, can that power actually be wielded in a way that's redemptive rather than blinding? Have you seen it done well?
Is partnership possible?
Is partnership possible?
Standing. I think it is. It demands work because there is the tendency to, again, assume might makes right and economic might makes right. So there's always the risk of on both sides of taking on a posture of just very patronizing and dependency building and feeling like then we are these wonderful benefactors and then we're off the hook for the justice issues. And so we can even perpetuate injustice by just giving charity. At the same time, there is the risk of people on the receiving end just tailoring and being obeisant to money in order. So the dynamic is a really problematic one. But I do believe partnership is possible when there is an honest assessment of means and need and the decisions regarding how the funding is dispersed, how it is used, what systems of mutual accountability there is, and where the relationship itself is nurtured, not beyond the economics. It's not just about I give and you receive. It's about we are together and we are going to figure out what we're going to do with this resource, which happens to be somewhat lopsidedly it's lopsided.
Sure.
But I there are models of true partnership when there is that humility, that listening, the non-strings attached kind of relationships.
It does sound like that requires a great, not just humility, as you pointed out, but it just takes more time and energy and
Absolutely.
effort to develop that level of trust and mutual relationship rather than just benefactor and recipient.
Yes, and the recognition that it's not just to give out of what is excess, but in a way to learn to give sacrificially. And because what's at stake here is not just means and non-means. It's an issue of justice. It's an issue, and God's reign is a reign of justice. Jesus says, search for God's kingdom and God's justice. What does that mean then? How do we recalibrate relations even economic relations in light of the values of God's reign and not that of the market and consumer society.
Let's turn corners a little bit to a different topic. And I've been wondering what's the right way to ask this question. And I'm not sure I found it yet. So be patient with me. One of the things we've seen in the American church in recent years that's really become problematic is the abuse of power that exists, particularly among celebrity church leaders who become exalted by their congregations, exalted by the marketplace. And in that highly powerful, visible place, they abuse their power, or the whole thing ends up falling apart. Some have equated what's gone on in the American church even to what's gone on in American politics, with the exaltation of Donald Trump, for example, as almost a fascist type leader that demands absolute loyalty from his followers. And some have made parallels to what historically has happened in some Latin American countries and contexts. So my question is, what does the Latin American church have to say to the American church about these dynamics? And what lessons can we learn from our sisters and brothers who've perhaps had more experience with these dynamics and their abuses, that so we don't have to learn it ourselves the hard way? What wisdom do you have, and does the Latin American church have for this repeated rise and fall of big, powerful leaders in the American church have to say to us?
Yeah, I wish Latin America could offer more. I think seeking soberly, there are some of the very same tendencies. It's just that there hasn't been the same opportunity to build up celebrities and such. And we do have these mega church pastors that get built up and almost worshipped in their uniqueness and in their powerful word and in their their personal style. And Latin America itself has had politically, even from the very beginning, a lot of these, we call them caudillos, single men leader guys who just will go out and have a magnetic, charismatic personality, and will have people follow them because of that personality. So there is some of that strand within Latin America. I think really it's more a matter of the whole body of Christ coming to a recognition that there only is one Lord, and that we cannot be, we should not allow ourselves to be enamored by the worldly values of stardom. There's we have soccer fans in Latin America, right? That's our number one star are soccer players, and they are gods. I mean, people worship soccer players. And so if you get a soccer player who becomes a pastor, then he's a double god. So we do have that tendency. So I don't think it would be fair to say we can teach the North. I think both North and South, and the same thing happens with Africa, with bishops and leaders that also get packaged as demigods. So I think it's more a matter of all of us recognizing that no one person can have so much power and recognition. And the danger is people build up stars. There's a sense in which these people don't become celebrities exclusively because of who they are or their personality. They get built up. They get managed to the top. And then there's all the circus of pulling them down.
Have you seen any reactions to that in your context that give you encouragement, that you feel is a good, healthy, appropriate correction to that dynamic? I see some of that happening in the United States, but I don't know what that correction looks like in other contexts.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm very familiar with a mega church in El Salvador called Elim Christian Mission. Over 100,000 members to this church, And the general pastor, you could think, could have, he could be, yes, one of these demigods. And yet, in some ways, just his humble submission to the Spirit and to the congregation, and to having, seeking out people that to be accountable to and such, has led him to have these mega congregations split into small, like house cell churches, very communally neighborhood cell groups. So power is in a way dispersed into the body itself. And he has a huge team of pastors that are that he's accountable to, and they work together, and so just to see that model of dispersed power, and placing the responsibility on gifted people, recognizing the gifts of the laity. Not all these leaders are theologically formed. A lot of them are lay leaders, but empowering the whole body to live out the gospel in their particular places has been a good antidote to this celebrity culture, I think.
Oh, that is encouraging. Last question. If you were to spend, I don't know, pick a semester, perhaps a couple of months with a group of American church leaders, and you were to bring them to Costa Rica or bring them to some other location in Latin America, what would you want them to learn from that context that they're probably not going to learn if they stay in the United States? What would you want to expose them to and make sure they're saturated in before they were to go back?
Mm-hmm. So probably number one would be for them to just embed and experience community, to taste what it means to be part of a community, and where things are more openly shared, all kinds of things, good, bad, happy, ugly, but there's so much more of a sense of belonging rather than this individual. Just so much of the U.S. culture, to me, that is so burdensome and causes so much pain to people, is the expectation that you need to be this unique individual hero. And everybody is supposed to be new messiahs in some way if you're a leader. And so belonging to community where everything is shown, your graces and your warts are present, and you can be real, and you can show weakness, and you can be upheld by the faith of others when yours is floundering. Just community. Another would be context, reality. Just walk the streets, sense the pain of real people in real places. Get to know the reality of poverty, of survival, of resilience, of solidarity in the midst of deprivation. So taste the context and recognize that even your theology, your way of looking and reading scripture, has been marked by your context. So by tasting another context, then maybe you could compare and say, oh, right, so maybe some of my readings of scripture have been prejudiced and blinded by my cultural contextual values. Here's another way. And so reading the Bible with people out of a different context could just bring a fresh look, a fresh experience of the story that we are called to be a part of.
Well, we can't obviously transport everybody to Latin America, but part of our hope for this series of interviews is exactly what you just described, that people would realize we are shaped by our context, and listening to voices like yours and others may jar us into realizing I need to get more exposure to other kinds of Christians, other forms of Christian expression, other types of community and culture. And that will only enrich my vision of who God is, what his mission is about, and who he's calling me to be. So, Ruth Padilla DeBorst, thank you so much for your time and your work and your scholarship and all the things you're contributing to the church where you are and around the world. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been wonderful to talk with you, and best to you also.
This episode of The Holy Post is being brought to you by our friends at World Relief. Whether you've been a part of the Holy Post audience for a long time or just recently started listening, you know that we do not shy away from taking on really heavy topics, and there have been no shortage of those in recent weeks. After we tackle those tough issues, we often hear from you, our audience, about what you can do to help. You're concerned over what's going on in the world and the crises both here at home and around the globe. And one of the questions we get consistently is which organizations to partner with in these challenging times. I know that many of you are compelled by your love for Christ and the biblical call to justice, and you want to put an end to the cycles of suffering that millions around the world are experiencing. Things like violence, oppression, extreme poverty, and displacement. It's so hard to know where to begin and who to trust. That's why we're excited to tell you about The Path from our friends at World Relief. World Relief is the global organization that we and our churches trust to bring sustainable solutions to some of the world's toughest problems. And The Path is World Relief's community of bold, compassionate women and men of faith who are committed to fighting back against suffering and injustice, and who are pursuing lasting change by giving monthly to World Relief. If you're looking for ways to put your faith into action, then I encourage you to join The Path. And you do that through a monthly gift at worldrelief.org/holypost. As a pathmaker, you'll be part of a like-minded global community that's committed to walking toward those who feel like the rest of the world is walking away from them. Whether it's the crisis in Ukraine, an earthquake in Haiti, or a refugee wave coming out of Afghanistan, you can trust that the Path community is already there making a difference. And you can too, by joining The Path today with your monthly gift at worldrelief.org/holypost. Okay, I'm back with Matt Soerens and Daniel Yang, two of the three co-authors of Inalienable, and we're going to debrief a little bit of what we just heard from Ruth Padilla DeBorst. So let me start off with this, guys. First of all, why did you want to feature her in this book about global voices and marginalized voices speaking to the American church? What is it about her that drew you to her leadership and perspective?
Yeah, part of the writing of this book was we did a bunch of interviews with Christian leaders in Latin America and Africa and Asia. And one of the first people, a couple of years ago now, when we were starting this process, who I wanted to interview was Ruth. I've only met her maybe once or twice, so it's not like we're close friends, but I've had the opportunity to meet her in the past, and I've read some of what she's written, and I've read a lot of what her father had written. René Padilla, who was a very famous Latin American theologian, passed away just a few years ago. And so when I think of, global Christian perspectives, she was high on my list. I know she's been really involved in lots of global Christian discussions with Lausanne and other things. But I knew from my interview with her, which, some of the same themes came up as with your interview that you just did. She's not gonna, she's not shy from talking about real dynamics. And I think that's something the American church really needs to hear. She's from Latin America, but she's also spent enough time in the U.S. that she understands the U.S. context and can speak to it from an informed perspective.
Yeah, I noticed in our conversation, while she didn't pull any punches, she was, pretty firm and direct. She was sensitive. She didn't just come from like an outside perspective with a flamethrower to the American church going, let's destroy this monstrosity. So she's a good bridging voice in that way, in being able to say the hard things, but understand the way they may be received, which is helpful. Daniel, what about you? From your point of view, let me bring this. One of the things she focused on was the way that American-based short-term missions can actually do more damage than good. Even though our intent may be to go to these other settings and do good, a lot of times it doesn't. What have you seen on that front, either in a negative thing to avoid or a positive example of how to do it well that brings flourishing to those groups we engage with?
Yeah, she made some really good points around that, and I think a part of it is also, she talked about the power dynamics, and so typically when we're thinking about missions from North America to other parts of the world, we're thinking about what do North Americans have to offer, and I think that's really important, but it's probably one side of it. And the thing that Ruth highlighted was that there's a learning experience that North Americans in particular, need to have as they're learning to partner with already Christians in different parts of the world. And to see that lateral partnership, I think, is really important. And so I was a part of an organization that launched an NGO called GlocalNet. And one of the big things that GlocalNet did was help to mobilize churches to work directly with governmental organizations in places like northern Vietnam, where you can only really go through governmental organizations rather than directly through churches. And what it did was it actually taught the church like how to come underneath the covering of something like a government organization and to work within limits and to trust the local municipalities to tell you what's actually needed in those areas. And to earn the respect of being able to work with local churches. And I think, that's a big learning curve that I think powerful organizations, albeit humble, compared to multinational corporations, but powerful organizations, mission organizations, like that posture of learning to partner with local municipalities in order to do the work that they've been called to do. I think that's something that people are learning right now.
So another element that came up in the conversation was for lack of a better term, the fuller vision of the gospel that Ruth carries and many people in the global South carry, frankly, many Christians outside of white North American context. Daniel, I want to talk a little bit about your experience with that, because your family story is an important one in that it's kind of a convoluted relationship with the North American church, in that North American missionaries came to, was it Vietnam, Cambodia? Where was your family
Yeah,
originally?
my parents were in Laos, but
Okay.
very similar stories
Laos.
across Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Right. So the Hmong people group, was your father the first to receive the
He
gospel and
was.
become yeah. So
Yeah, he
then
was. Hmm.
your family comes to the United States, where suddenly you find yourself immersed in the North American church, but that was a bit of a culture shock and the change that entailed. What has your family, your experience been with your vision of the gospel, both from your heritage in Laos coming to the United States, and then as you hear these global voices, is there a tension there, or does it one side seem to resonate with what your own experience has been?
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of an insider outsider knowledge thing, sometimes that I feel like folks like me have. And I think it's not dissimilar to some of our Latin American sisters and brothers that have come in from the southern border as well. And I think the dynamic of so for me, as somebody who was technically American born, even though, my joke is I said in the book, I was conceived in a Thailand refugee camp. I realized that I was socialized into something that was more than just biblical Christianity.
Right.
That there was a cultural, expression of biblical Christianity that I inherited, and for better or for worse, that is the version of Christianity that I grew up in. But when I contrast that to, Hmong people who are in Vietnam, which is the fastest growing minority population, the largest minority population in Vietnam, and the most recent people movement from to Jesus is among Hmong people in northern Vietnam. I can see the stark differences between American Christianity and Christianity in other parts of the world. And so I feel like there is a bit of translation and navigation that folks similar to myself, get to provide. And I often say that in some ways we are in God's sovereignty, like the missionaries to North America. And at the very minimum, helping to see the contrast that like American civil religion is not the same thing as biblical Christianity.
Yeah, amen. Matt, in your experience working with a lot of the folks coming in through the southern border, Latino immigrants, you're in a Spanish-speaking church. What contribution do you feel that they're bringing in to the North American context? Just as Daniel said, sort of feels like they're the missionaries to the North American church. What unique perspective are Latinos bringing into the North American church right now that you think we need to hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, but one thing, and Ruth mentioned this as well, is just the community orientation that is
Hmm.
is a big part of life in Latin America. People rely on one another, and within a family, but often a broader understanding of family than we have in North America, which is like my spouse and my minor children, and once they're 18, they're out of the house. Um, for a lot of folks in Latin America, I think this is especially true in evangelical churches in Latin America, which are, as Ruth said, tend to be a minority in most of those contexts. The church is the family. And we see that even more, I think, in immigrant communities where people have often left behind extended family and lean on their church community for a lot more than to spend, 75 to 90 minutes together on 3 Sundays out of 4 on average. It's a lot more than that occasional church worship experience. One thing, Daniel and I did this event a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers on our panel said, in our churches, we're so shocked by how American churches just empty out the parking lot as soon as the service is over. Like, it's like you really don't want to be together as quickly as you can get apart from each other. That seems to be the goal. Whereas in most Latino immigrant churches, people stop and linger, and there's conversation before and after, and whenever there's the opportunity for a shared meal. People want to spend time together, and that sense of community is more than just the people who I, sing a few songs and hear a sermon with once a week.
Is part of that dynamic, especially among immigrant churches of different variety, is it because they spend the rest of the week engaged in a culture that's not indigenous to their own culture? They feel like outsiders. So when they come to church, oh, these are my people. These are folks I can connect with. And so there's a greater desire to linger, to engage, to have more community and fellowship. Whereas in a typical white evangelical church, the attitude is, yeah, okay, I did my thing. Punch that off the list. I'm going to go on and do the rest of the activities I enjoy in the week because this is my indigenous culture and I'm totally at home and familiar with it 24/7.
Yeah, it's a good question. Daniel, I'd love your perspective, having spent a lot of time among churches, but I think it's some of both. Part of it is the culture. Like in Latin America, Latinos spend a lot more time in a community orientation than our more individualistic or sort of immediate family focus in the US. But I do think for a lot of people, there is that dynamic. I mean, it varies. Some people are speaking Spanish all week long in their work, and there may be a minority within a particular community, but they're not lacking for community throughout the week either necessarily. But some people are. Some people are fairly isolated, and that church experience is a time to kind of relax and be among people who they don't need to sort of always be presenting themselves and be really conscious of how they're presenting themselves. I'm curious what you'd say to
Yeah,
that.
a part of it is just pragmatics. I think it's inconvenient, but it's practical for immigrant churches to start off church with the meal or to end service with the meal, because in the evening there's another service or there's some kind of social event going on. And so, like, I think, to Skye, to your point, yes, I do think that there's a fatigue that they feel throughout the week, that they're not with their people as much. And so when they are together, they try to maximize that time. I really think that's, probably true. But also, like, the practical things of sharing meals together every weekend. And there are a lot of churches that do that all throughout Chicagoland. Matt, there's a Hmong church a couple blocks away from you, and they start off service, with breakfast. I've preached at a couple of Vietnamese churches here in Wheaton, and after every service, we have lunch together. And so I think that is a practical thing. It's just kind of like, yeah, why not eat lunch afterwards? Because we're all going to be hungry and we don't want to rush home. So, but I also think that, like, this was a point that Ruth made, and she was, I think she was quoting Stephen Warner, where Stephen Warner says that immigration doesn't mean the de-Christianization of the United States, but it's the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. And I think in some ways, like, what immigrant churches have been able to bring, in addition to their culture and to their kind of flavor of Christianity, is they're revealing that, like, America, we have a very, like, European understanding of what church is. And our motifs around church tend to be around institutions and organizations. And for immigrants, their motifs still largely, although it's changing, still largely is the family.
Right. So that raises a question. And having been a part of churches that are fairly diverse with different cultural dynamics, coming from a mixed culture home, and my father's an immigrant, my mother's a white American, I've kind of navigated these waters most of my life. But one of the eternal challenges is if we're going to actually benefit from one another, if we're going to be influenced by one another, we have to be willing to surrender some of our own preferences, our own comfortable way of doing things. And a lot of times that is communicated to the majority white culture. Hey, you guys need to bend if you're going to welcome these different immigrant brothers and sisters in and have this diversity. But it also requires bending on the part of the immigrant group, which just the act of coming to this country is a massive adjustment and bending. What do you draw from our Christian tradition to give people the vision and the wherewithal to do that hard work in order to engage one another? Because it would be, frankly, so much easier if we just siloed ourselves into these homogenous groups. And there's stats that say those churches grow more quickly. This is kind of what the mega seeker-driven movement is all about over the last 40 years. And I think a lot of us would argue we can't keep going that way. It's not healthy for the church. It's not healthy for the mission. So what do you draw from to convince people to be uncomfortable at church in order to engage with people who are different?
I think for me, it's theological, Skye. I mean, I think with very practical implications. So, my part in this book is I'm a missiologist, and so when we think about like multi-ethnic models in America, there's a couple of things. There's kind of the segregationist type thing, where people come up and it's diversity quota, and you kind of have like 15% of African Americans, and you kind of 25% of this, and we think of multi-ethnicity as that. There's kind of a segregationist understanding. And then there's a bit of like this assimilationist, so it's like, you ascend to one particular culture. And so a large number of multi-ethnic churches have a white leadership, model, and people of color assimilate to that. And so now I'm not speaking to white people at this point. I'm speaking to those who are minority or immigrants like myself and my family. There is an incarnational model that I constantly, wrestle with myself and others. And that is in the likeness of Jesus, who did this himself. How do I lay down preferences, and how do I become like the other so that I might win the other? Again, that's a principle that Paul picked up on. And I think it's easier for the immigrant to do that because by nature they're outnumbered in a sense. And so, but there's that that denying of yourself. Paul says in Romans 15, and this is where you have to understand that this is gospel, this is theological, because the gospel gives you privilege in Christ. You can lay down certain preferences. And Paul says in Romans chapter 15 that, we who are strong have the obligations to bear the failings of the weak. And he's not saying strong in the sense of systematic power necessarily, but I think those of us who feel settled in the gospel, we're rooted in our gospel identity, then you now have the wherewithal to lay down preferences. Because if you don't get to that point, then what you end up doing at some point is you're just practicing the segregationist or the assimilationist model.
Wow. Matt, you're at a Spanish-speaking church. What's it been like for you as a white American to have to lay down some of your preferences and be a part of that community?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely moments when I'm uncomfortable. Just culturally, it's not everything that I'm used to. And both my wife and I have spent time in Latin America and spent time in churches in Latin America. But even there's such a diversity there, of what that looks like, that there's a lot that's new. And I think we were pretty intentional for the first several years we were there. We really just wanted to be active members. We, did the membership class and we're part of the church. But we didn't want to share too many opinions because we felt like our job was to sort of understand what's going on around us, and we didn't want to stick out any more than we do just because of who we are. And there are challenges. Like, we both speak Spanish. My kids don't speak Spanish perfectly. They're working on it. We're convinced that they'll pick it up one of these days if they hear it enough. But they don't always love sitting through a worship service in a language they don't really understand. But for us, that has been an opportunity to teach our kids about a posture of humility. Like, think about how hard it is for the kids in your school who don't speak English very well, and they're thrown into a classroom and expected to learn the language, and most of them do, pretty quickly. But it's hard, it's disorienting, and it's frustrating. And there's lots of those moments, but also there's so many ways that we've been blessed by that community as well, and really embraced. I mean, really, I think one example, like we We baptized my son, and my relatives were all there who don't speak Spanish. And we hadn't necessarily informed our pastor that I'd have a bunch of non-Spanish speaking folks coming, and we have translation devices so they can translate to English, but we didn't have enough because of all of my white people relatives showing up. And my pastor, Pastor Alex, basically said, "Well, we'll just do the service bilingually. Like, I'll just go back and forth between English and Spanish, and whoever's reading the scripture, can you make sure we do this in English and Spanish?" And just like on the spot. And I was like, "Oh no, you don't have to do that. It's fine." And it just struck me, like, I don't know any white churches that would on the spot decide to turn their service bilingual because like 10 Spanish speakers showed up. Like that just wouldn't be on the menu
A
of
lot
options.
of them wouldn't even be equipped to do it.
Well, that's also true.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to a hospitality that, just made us feel extremely welcome, that we were a part of this and they wanted our family to feel fully welcome as well.
Okay, last question. Speaking of hospitality, again, for decades in the American white evangelical context, we have been very fixated on pragmatism and church growth. And a lot of that has meant figure out what your target audience wants and then create a church that reflects that and will make them feel comfortable and at home. And it's very customer oriented and market driven. That's sort of become our new form of hospitality. Rather than actually caring for the people that walk through the door, we're going to, in advance, do some market research, find out who you are and what you like, and make sure that we create that kind of a church. But it's been, quote unquote, effective in growing really big churches. And it's a model that we've exported to other parts of the world because the American church has a lot of power, a lot of influence, a lot of institutional gravity and pull around the world. What's bad about that model being exported to places like where Ruth is or other folks that you interviewed? When we think about this kingdom of God idea, the American church is shrinking, but its influence is still disproportionate around the world. What's been good and bad about what we've exported?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm thinking about the Hillsong documentary, and it's very clear that the model that Hillsong adapted was learned, here in America. And for what it's worth, people can judge whether or not that was success or not. But and I'm definitely not here to bash on large churches, and I don't think either one of us want to do that. But I would say it's amazing that despite the economic model, and that's what it is. I mean, it's an economic model of the church that North America has kind of propagated. It's surprising that it has been helpful and also both harmful. And I think the helpful parts are in that, there are ways in which, North American organizations, mission organizations, and the church model has helped to, at least in the short term, alleviate certain kinds of, humanitarian issues. And so I think, large churches in America still fund quite a bit of humanitarian work around the world. And I don't think we want to quite yet pull the plug on that.
Of course not.
But then the flip side of it is that I think we're seeing that this is an iteration, that we need to move beyond this iteration. We need to move beyond, this power dynamic to more of a true, lateral partnership model. And I think a part of this is, so it's not like completely leaving the consumer mentality behind. I think we all would agree that worship services shouldn't be manicured to the expectation of the, attender. But there's this prosumer thing. It's kind of like, okay, so let's teach people to, as they consume or whatever it is, as they participate, how do you produce, right? And I think whether it's like Uber, Etsy, Airbnb, it's kind of like your churches could be platforms where people create and people participate. And I think that that is an ownership model that we need to get beyond. And honestly, I think in places like Iran, as far as the way that I understand things in Iran, northern Vietnam, where I've spent a lot of time, house church models actually lend itself better to that prosumer type thing where you come and learn and you go and do.
Well, I'm sure a megachurch model is not exactly possible in Iran right now. So that's one factor,
exactly.
But it is sort of I've been a part of a house church model since COVID started. And one of the things I keep hearing from other people that are a part of it is you can't not be involved here. You can't just sit back and take it in. You're called upon to engage and participate and help. And for people who don't want that, I can understand them shying away from a house church model, but you're right, Daniel. Like you have to be engaged and participate in the creation of what this community is doing in those smaller environments in a way that you may not be called upon to in a big place that has lots of resources. Matt, last word on this?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think Ruth spoke to some of this really, really well, in that a lot of the models of church that we've created in the United States, and in some ways, I mean, we do see parts of this being exported to Latin America. I've seen some of that, but at its best, the church is this alternative community, that we're modeling for society what it looks like to be this people called by God, living out the truth of the gospel. And that's possible in the United States. It's possible in Latin America. But it's most possible when we're learning from each other. And that's what I so valued about what Ruth shared in terms of what it looks like to have genuine, humble, mutual partnership.
Yeah, it really does come back to that posture, that attitude of teachability, willingness to surrender our preferences, as you talked about, Daniel, teachability, hearing from voices we wouldn't normally hear from. If that posture is there, I have to believe that God's Spirit is going to bear good fruit in that. But that's where it all begins. Daniel Yang, Matthew Soerens, thank you both again for your time. Thank you for your book. For those of you who want to pick it up, it's Inalienable: How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church. We're going to feature more of the voices in this book in upcoming episodes, more voices like Ruth's from different parts of the world, and we'll be back with you guys in the future as well. Thank you both.
Thanks, Skye.
What in the World is a production of Holy Post Media. It's based on the book Inalienable by Eric Costanzo, Daniel Yang, and Matthew Soerens, and features the authors, along with me, Skye Jethani. Production by Julie Betcher and Carla Haskins. Editing by Jason Rugg. Theme song by Phil Vischer. We are especially grateful for Holy Post Patreon supporters who make productions like this possible. If you want access to more common good Christian content like this, go to holypost.com for more podcasts, articles, and resources. Be sure to rate and comment on the show wherever you get your podcasts, so others can discover smart Christian content from people who take Jesus seriously, but not themselves.